coming to you live from the sixth floor of the Hiawatha here in Portland, Maine. It is the System Failure Podcast number 3. What's going on, Nate?
Hey, Brian. How you doing?
Pretty good.
Well, I'm given to understand that you had a little bone to pick at the top of this podcast, maybe with Tim Pool specifically, because you've been listening to one of his podcasts, or just generally the way that Marxism is understood in our culture. So why don't you tell us what that bone is you'd like to pick?
Yeah, well, there's just this thing where, we're sold these ideas of like culture issues instead of like actual communism or socialism, and then so people say that socialism is bad or that communism is bad because what we're being fed by our shadowy elites is like not actually good, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to go all the way back to the red baiting of the 50s, or even before that, like the Sacco and Vanzetti trials down there in Braintree, Massachusetts, that were famous examples of anarchists or communists being set up or used as political scapegoats. So there is a weird thing where like trucking with communism is like praying to the devil in the Middle Ages, right? It's the one thing you must never do. So there is that extreme sort of overreaction to communism that is an artifact of our culture. And so it does seem like the modern culture war is just kind of, the so-called culture war is kind of, if you're against the left, you just sort of reflexively refer to what you're against as communism. And that really leads to this weird blending of communism, which, like, if you crack an old Karl Marx book, there's nothing in there about like BLM or trans rights or any of these other supposedly hot topic issues today. So I do know what you're saying and roll my eyes too when confronted with that thing.
Obviously, I support Black lives and people should express themselves any way they want. But it's just that, like, what we actually want, we should, like, tax the rich and give that money to people, and then, like, everyone's lives would be a lot better, right?
Yeah, it's an experiment that we tried in this country, jacking up taxes on the rich and using it to make society better. From the 30s to something like the 70s or 80s, that was definitely the case, and most people, whatever their political persuasion, identify that as a golden era. But it's interesting, it's interesting that what one would like is not, it's like, say, hey guys, I think we're being distracted like a matador distracts a bull with a cape. When you point that out and say, I think we may be being distracted from class issues by these other sorts of lefty issues, then one would like to not be called a bigot, it'd be nice.
Well, obviously the schism between like class and just the way like class is like kept out of the conversation. And if you like talk about taxing the rich, what do they accuse you of? Of like classism? That's like a thing, right?
Yeah, they'd like to avoid any sort of mention of any sort of class analysis or class consciousness. That we like to make sure that that's not something that's a regular tradition here in the good old US of A.
I mean, I would say that nothing seems more transparently obvious that there's a propaganda like censorship campaign like against class awareness breaking out and trying to make classism into a bad thing. That's what they did when Bernie Sanders was running against Joe Biden, as they called Bernie Bros classist.
Yeah, and that really only gets us as far as socialism. So interestingly here, I remember in 2009 going to the movie theater and seeing Michael Moore's movie Capitalism, A Love Story. And that movie was really kind of an advertisement for socialism or a decry. We all know how Michael Moore's movies are. They're wildly entertaining, but they usually are pushing a message. And the message was something like we should implement the sorts of policies, Brian, that you're referring to that have been successful in America's own recent history. But there's also a whole other level beyond this, which is commonly called communism, which is where workers own the means of production, which I think is the purest form of the idea of communism. But that's really the thing that they're decrying, like the creeping tendrils of communism are going to force some kind of crazy agenda down all of our throats, some kind of egalitarian, ultra woke agenda. And I don't know, I feel like that weird boogeyman just misses the total idea of, in this case of communism, workers owning the means of production directly, which would prevent things like factories from moving overseas to China. Some of the most major blights on American society are inflicted on us by a lack of democracy. over the workplace. We can get into that discussion, but then there's also the workers should, not just that workers should own the means of production, but also that like we should heavily, like you're saying, heavily tax the rich and use that to recycle money, kind of like the water cycle, where water evaporates off the ocean, forms clouds, the clouds blow over the mountains, and then there over the cooler mountains they fall like rain, the rains form the streams and rivers that flow into the lakes that eventually flow into the ocean. And the idea is that money has a way of pooling in the coffers of the rich, and in order to keep the virtuous cycle of the economy going, you have to move it back to the beginning of the water cycle again by using policy to remove it and give it to the poor. So these are both valid ideas that get lost in the discussion when leftism is just painted as wokeism and nothing else. And I think it has to be deliberate. There's no way it's a coincidence given the crazy history of red baiting that we have been party to here in the United States.
Well, I think you have to be a realist. See, maybe in this way, perhaps we disagree slightly. Well, I don't think it's actually very likely that we start taxing the rich, practically speaking. And so it just, like, I think we should tax the rich, but if that were to happen, like, what would that mean? Like, just our political system we have right now is not at all set up to tax the rich, right?
Do you mean that in the sense that they wouldn't know what to do with all the money and would spend it irresponsibly or possibly even on corruption? Or do you mean it in the sense that we've, are incapable of it in some other way?
Well, like, I mean, yeah, we are literally not set up as a government. Like, well, the people we have in charge are not going to do that, right?
Yeah, well, of course, their campaign contributions are all paid by the rich, of course. So they're...
Yeah, so it would mean something about, like, that something had changed fundamentally if we were able to tax the rich, right?
Well, in the 1930s, that thing was the Great Depression and epic stock market crash to mirror the fall of Rome. I mean, it was in an insane state. FDR later gave a speech where he said that, if this administration, which was accused of being red, of course, the papers decried the soak the rich legislation that would vastly increase taxes on the wealthy and corporations. But he said if this administration had any inclination to change the means of private profit that run the country, all we had to do was sit there and fold our arms and let capitalism continue to decay to the point where it had in 1932. Something along those lines is the quote he gave. But so you say it's impossible and that we're not set up to do it, but we have done it in living memory. So I put the question back to you. What do you think has changed?
Well, I mean, a lot has changed. Well, there's just all this wealth after World War II, right? But, I think just the people in charge have gotten better at gaming the system. And so, the front runners have just gotten further and ahead and have just better figured out how to extract wealth from, everyone else. And so, I mean, that's why it costs like $50,000 to go to college now when, it cost our parents way less.
Yeah, but again, that thing happened in recent memory. There was a big flip in the 1970s where we went from, taxing the money we need to keep the cycle running, right? Marx's prediction that it would break down when the rich gained too much influence due to the introduction or advent of technology, which is what you just mentioned. But we flipped a switch in the 1970s. We went from, taxing that money from the rich and redistributing it to the poor to borrowing it from the rich instead via credit cards and all manner of other debt instruments, and that way keep the engine of the economy running. But of course, I mean, that's that is obviously a scheme that can only run for so long, borrowing money at interest to keep, because eventually we're going to have to admit the bills can't be paid. And that really brings us to our current moment in time. I think an admission on that front could lead to progress to a restoration of some of the prior legislation that made this country, the golden age that it was for some of the people that lived here.
I mean, to be clear, things could change in a way that, we could start taxing the rich. I guess, what happens in this upcoming election could decide that. I mean, suppose that Donald runs again and wins. That'll create some kind of change. I would agree that the COVID is definitely a catalyst for change. And yeah, I would agree that the system, the way it is, doesn't seem like it can last in perpetuity. So I think the system could last, though, anywhere between now and November. So that's 4 months or something. And it could last from 4 months to like another 150 years. Obviously, I agree, with your fundamental thesis that society did collapse in 2008. We're just in this, transitioning time, and so we're just going to cannibalize on each other for a little while here.
Yeah, so that's what makes analysis that just kind of conflates all these ideas with the recovery of political rights for certain minorities or otherwise politically disadvantaged people is a discussion well worth having, but also a front we've made a lot of recent progress on. And we're watching like kind of the bottom fall out of society. The situation here in Portland, Maine sure has been illuminating. We now have tent cities set up in all of our major parks where that wouldn't have been the case pre-COVID. We certainly had our population of unhoused prior to COVID, but it's really exploded. Obviously property values have skyrocketed here in the wake of COVID. And I think that this sort of pattern is playing out in most major cities across the U.S. So I think things definitely seem like they're accelerating out there, and it seems like the time has long come for some more serious conversation. Not that we need to flip the switch and have some kind of a communist revolution. Although I do like to say that I do like to use the word communism. It gets a great reaction from people like over 50. I have wielding that as an interesting conversational tool. But the time is long past for a conversation that at least takes some of these Marxist critiques seriously, given especially now we've got ChatGPT and the big writer strike on it and actor strike on in Hollywood, we really have to kind of have an actual adult conversation and a collision with some of these Marxian ideas. I think that would be, when you say something changing in the future, people just talking to each other and being connected on podcasts like this is a big part of any change that's going to happen. But I think we finally need to have, again, not a wholesale adoption of Marxist policies or veneration of Marx as some kind of a prophet. We just need to grapple with what he had, those ideas he had on an adult level, instead of just plugging our ears and seeing la la, which seems to be the level of maturity that we're bringing to the situation at this moment.
Well, to me, Marxism is like an analysis of the situation and isn't exactly proscriptive, right? So cultural Marxism is this term that's come to mean, all the bad parts of communism, all the historical problems.
Yeah. Well, the notorious problems of communism are long and very well documented. I would only point to some of its obvious successes that are never talked about. Again, not as a way advocating for copying either the two most famous communist systems of all time. We don't want, they have obvious problems. We don't want to copy their system exactly, but let's look at where they're successful and copy the parts of their society that make them successful. And one obvious case is the space race, where the Soviet Union went from a Russia that was princes and peasants and serfs, and like a borderline medieval society, right into the industrial age. And virtually every single major achievement in the space race was won by the Soviets. First person in space, first object on the moon. They have a long list of achievements. We got first person on the moon, but that's pretty much it. They were neck and neck with us, competing with the major industrial power of the time. And they did it in a single generation. They converted this town, this civilization of castles and villages into an industrial powerhouse in one generation. That's unbelievable. And the Chinese are outgrowing us. Obviously, in terms of economic competition, they have gained on us in a way that is unprecedented in the annals of history. So at least from the somewhat dubious measure of GDP, they've been putting up numbers that we can only dream of here in the United States. So in other words, they're very organized. Now, there are obvious drawbacks to the way that these two civilizations have done business. I think a much more democratic model would be the prescription here. But in any case, it is definitely worth noticing that despite communism and socialism's notorious reputations, they have been successful. And other places in the world do take these ideologies with at least some seriousness. You can vote for a communist party in France, for example. It's not seen as some crazy communing with the devil sort of thing to do. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like something has to give. And eventually people are going to need to start talking about the way that we organize production and distribution, because it's getting less and less usable, the system of ours. And most of us are spending our days doing less and less sensible things. I think the system shows serious signs of not being able to get out of the corner it's painted itself into. And so, again, I'll reiterate, that's why I think conversations like these are long overdue.
I mean, it is interesting that every time there's a people's uprising in South America, the United States military has to go in and knock it down. I mean, that doesn't really explain why socialism is so evil. It seems like the worst part about socialism is that, well, it gets corrupted by like capitalist interests. I mean, it's interesting that the United States sent troops in 1915 or whatever to fight against the proletariat in like the Soviet Revolution, right?
Yeah, so there was a certain number of U.S. troops. This is the interesting history. There's that movie from 1985 with Swayze, Red Dawn, you know, where the communists parachute into like Denver, Colorado, or the mountains of Colorado, and the school kids, you know, the high school kids defend. Like that scenario was only played out in reverse. In 1918, after the Great War ended, there were a certain number of American troops and British and French and Japanese troops who didn't go home. They instead went to the Soviet Union to fight on the white side, that is the pro-monarchist side, and try to stop the Reds from seizing control of the massive country with all those natural resources. So yes, that did happen. The analysis of Marx was really the story of the collision of this constant uptick in democracy that's noticeable when you kind of view history as a stock market chart. We got into this a little bit on the last pod. There's a progression to society where people they're rigid and top down at the in the aftermath of the agricultural revolution, but they get more democratic as history wears on. This seems to be the course of history, at least to the Western mind. And then there's a parallel, stock market chart that goes up over time in technology. Sometimes technology is lost, or, sometimes there's setbacks. But over the course of time, we generally expect better and better technology to manifest itself in society. And the collision of these two long and ancient trajectories is really what Marx was obsessed with when he sat down to write his 3 volumes of Capital and his various other notable works. And so it doesn't seem like much of a surprise to me that when we think about, okay, things aren't working so well, systems are failing on around us, or on a downward trajectory towards failure. You really have to start thinking about casting your mind towards things like the long sweep of history. That's really when it becomes valuable, because it gives you a sort of a storyline or a narrative, or a broader narrative to establish yourself in. Because otherwise you have no choice but to kind of freak out that things are getting worse, right?
Well, another thing that's certainly changing is technology. I was remarking before about how the election could be a catalyst for change to start taxing the rich, for instance. And technology is definitely a crazy wild card. Although I guess I could see AI going either way and furthering our enslavement or possibly freeing us.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the AI enslaving us or freeing us is really the road that diverges when you think about AI managing and performing most production and distribution functions. It's just, if someone owns those robots, if like private citizens have rights to own that kind of huge apparatus of production with no other oversight or no other ability to control, then we sure are in for a dystopia. But who could really expect that a system like that could possibly exist for long? Like, why most people are just going to exist having nothing while one person hoards everything, right? That situation never lasts. That's why the empires fall, right? They get too top heavy. It happens every time.
Well, if the AI takes over, we could be pretty effed. But I think a system, I have to imagine our AI, the AI thing that we're giving birth to, is going to be more sophisticated than ourselves, and therefore like has to be better. How long could it stay as like a tool of our capitalist oppressors to hold us down, right?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine something that has that kind of intelligence. But on the other hand, in our own society as it exists today, it doesn't seem like the smartest people are in control at all. It doesn't seem, in other words, that intelligence translates to control. Maybe it's different if you're talking about hyperintelligence. That could be a big X factor. It's a big unknown. But I definitely think that a lot of sort of white collar work is put in immediate peril of AI prior to AI becoming effective enough to outmaneuver humans and seize control of everything and enslave us all. There'll be a window in which tons of white collar people are out of work. Heretofore technologies primarily attacked the jobs of the blue collar crew, but this time it's coming for some people who are upper middle class, who might have some much more political clout, and to say, wait a second, we need to have a look at how we're structuring the economy here, because we're hurtling towards a situation where a tiny number of people are going to have a ridiculous amount of control over it. And that runs antithetically to our notion of democracy. That violates our notion of democracy that we're raised with, despite the fact that we don't have democracy when it comes to the means of production and distribution.
I think actually maybe my mind has changed. I think change is coming soon. And yeah, you'd have to say that things got pretty real during the COVID. And so how long until things get real again?
Well, I think art, we've said it, there's a constant theme here at System Failure, but art is really important, or expression is really important, if we can broaden it to expression even, of which, the art of expression really, I guess, is what we're talking about. Let's put it that way. Podcasts like this, people expressing ideas and connecting with each other like nodes in a network thanks to the internet, I think has the power to really really cut through the old crazy anti-red from vintage 1950 paranoia that we just have to get beyond that in order to advance the conversation. But I think it'll happen, like Malcolm Gladwell would say, as a tipping point. It's all going to happen fast, in other words. I've heard Chris Hedges used the analogy of the Protestant clergy of Berlin in '89, assuring their flock that yes, we're making political progress towards getting the wall taken down, but no, these things, you know the bureaucracy, the legislative process, we might have to live with it for years and years, but we're making progress. And then the thing happened like within a couple days. The situation just escalated like a wave breaking. It all happened fast. And so I wonder how much further we have to go. There was quite a harrowing saga outside my window on Thursday night. There was a woman who lost her mind. Like, she finally snapped. She must have been unhoused. She didn't look well. She was kind of heavy set. Middle-aged, late middle-aged, graying, stringy hair, blue windbreaker. And she finally snapped and just started attacking strangers. And we heard squawking. This is outside of our window here in the apartment tower at the Hiawatha up on the 8th floor. And we looked out and saw this woman attack a couple. And the man of the couple got between them and ushered his mate away quickly. And then she turned. There was a concert going on at one Longfellow Square. And there were people, doing the usual smoking routine of hanging out around the entrance. And she attacked some woman with blonde hair, and that fight went to the ground with kicking and clawing, and there was shrieking. It was insane. Finally, the crowd got the victim, away from the crazy clawing woman. And then, the lads in the crowd were trying to just kind of push her away from the other people and keep her at bay. And she would attack whoever got close to her. And she got into a third fight with one of these dudes. And then finally, after that dude disentangled himself and scampered away, finally the cops showed up. But it just really goes to show that people are going off crazier than normal. I mean, you would never have seen this, even in my previous years here at the Hiawatha. Nothing quite that crazy. This woman was just going to keep attacking people until the police came and carried her away. They have a repurposed ambulance that's like a paddy wagon, the Portland PD do, and they put her in there. By this time, Tracy and I had descended to the second floor to look out of the observation deck window. We could hear her smashing and screaming inside that van. The thing was like rocking, and the cops quickly drove it away at that point, and that was the last we saw of her. The pot really seems like it's boiling. I think most people must be noticing this in the centers of population concentration, or the urban centers. It can't just be Portland, Maine. And indeed, I've seen YouTube videos from San Francisco, Philadelphia, Los Angeles that all make all curl your toes. Oof. And we just seem to have it in microcosm here. It will drive you insane that it's not really reflected, in the narratives of the news media or the movies. It definitely makes for an eerie era of hypernormalization. So that's where I'm at. I gotta think that people will tough it out for a few more years, but eventually, we're going to have to just shrug our shoulders and say, is it really worth going to work or paying rent? Like, what? The whole thing is really seems like it's becoming more and more absurd to more and more people. And that mutation or evolution has definitely accelerated thanks to the COVID era, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, man, I don't know. Poor people matter.
How are we? Do we have a distorted view because we live in downtown Portland? Is really the rest of the country fine, and it's only in the urban centers where things are chaotic? I don't know. It really feels like there has to be some measure of the news media trying to get us ratcheted up because they want to get clicks for their advertisers, or drive engagement with their app, or get us to sit for their cable television, whatever, however they make their money. Is it part of it that I don't know. It's hard to know how objective an observer you really are, because it's not really possible to be such a thing, I suppose. How
many homeless people do you think are in the United States? It's got to be like millions and millions, right?
Yeah, I got to think so. I saw a report from the United Way, which concluded that there are 28 vacant homes in the United States for every one homeless person. People say that the housing prices are the result of NIMBYism and zoning regulations, but if we're at a state where there's 28 vacant homes for every one homeless person. And we are talking about insane inefficiency on the part of our system of housing production and distribution. There's definitely a location problem. There's going to be a lot of houses that are like vacant in coal country West Virginia that no one wants to live in necessarily, because those towns, there's no more coal mining and those towns are gone and there's no one else living there. It still speaks to a massive inefficiency in the way that we provide housing. And something's got to be, like, that's going to have to be addressed at some point. It can't just, that's a really wild number in my mind. One in 28. We can put the link in the show notes so other people can click on the United Way's report and judge for themselves.
See, it sounds like a questionable number, just because if there was 28 empty units for every person, that would mean there's like a lot of open housing. It seems like the price of housing should be cheaper. You just don't see that many open houses around.
I think there's a lot of vacant houses around. You hear stories about people walking down through downtown Manhattan and Vancouver, and all those apartment towers are all dark because they're all investment properties. They're ways for foreign nationals to park money here in the United States in a way without having to have a bank account necessarily, and in a way that appreciates value really rapidly. In the years past, I've seen numbers as low as 7 and as high as 22. But I don't think anyone would say that. I think 7 is a really, really is the lowest possible estimate. So let's say it's not 1 in 28. Let's say it's actually 1 in 7, because the United Way want to err on the most like charity worthy side of the illustration. So let's say it's actually 1 in 7. You're still talking about 7 houses for every unhoused person. That's just sitting there with nothing going on, or maybe being used as an Airbnb. That would probably get you more in the 22 or 28 range if you count the Airbnbs. So yeah, it's like we've got to face. No one wants to sell the house that's supposedly worth $400K for $200K or $100K or $50K, because that will drop the price of all the houses surrounding it down to that level. So no one wants to let the transaction take place at that and take that huge a haircut. So I think that's part of it. And then the other part is that, like, houses in West Virginia, I think they would be valued maybe at $0. Remember when Detroit was really in a state of disrepair in like the 2000s, in the 8 Mile era, and there were properties for $1 that you could buy, but no one wanted them because they would come with city taxes and it would just be a money pit. There'd be no way to make your money back if you were to invest in those properties. I think 1 in 7 is absolutely outrageous.
Okay, so we went and pulled up the article here. It is dated
March the 28th, 2023.
That's it. And, well, it just says right in bold at the top that 28 vacant homes for every one person experiencing homelessness in the U.S. And that's unitedway.org from March 28th of 2023. Man, that's like a truly shocking statistic. I mean, that must mean it must be like including like apartments or something. But at any rate, that is definitely a truly shocking statistic.
Yeah, man. Well, like, we live in this apartment tower on top of each other in single room studio apartments, and they're like, hotel rooms basically. But meanwhile, there's 28 houses that's just empty, and like people who can't find room to feel like they have room to have kids. That is a truly crazy situation to be in. Even if the number is 1 in 7, that rock bottom, like the most conservative possible estimate, that's still wild. Again, there's a location problem that comes with lumping the whole country together, but I still think that it speaks to an underlying reality that's not what's represented on the TV.
Yeah, well, one thing about our present time for sure is that we've just never had so much capacity for things to be different, or like just with all the technology available in materials. Obviously, I guess a socialist utopia would be harder to happen with less advanced technology. So like maybe back in like the 1800s, for instance. But now we just live in such a insane time of excess that we have to like artificially burden ourselves. We should be living in a futuristic society, flying cars, right?
We should be, you would think we would be ecstatic when labor-saving technology gets invented. That, like, if the technology comes around that cuts your workday in half, that would normally be a source for celebration for any sane society. But in our society, you'd be like, okay, well, does this mean that half of us are going to get fired? And then that means you're now out looking for a job in a new profession. And that's really, that decision-making arises from the non-democratic arrangement where one person wears the owner hat and that's all, and then some people wear the worker's hat and that's all. What you want is a blend of those two roles in every individual at the workplace or on the job site. It's the same idea as democracy. If you have everyone take part in the decision, cancels out the individual egos, so you don't get this egoic decision-making apparatus that leads to the glorification of just one individual, like the old god-king societies, or even the medieval societies where, the king wasn't God, he was God adjacent, though. He was, the church was your avenue to God. It's certainly interesting. There's that other famous definition of communism, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, which is interesting. I mean, that really strikes me as the ultimate goal of that's like the gold standard of each and every society. That's really, you're distilled down to like a not what you would like society to be. We should all be striving to achieve that. And it's interesting. People have this old canard that communism goes against human nature, which I find to be extremely odd, given the fact that almost all the labor we all do in our lives is communistic in fashion. What I mean by that is that when you're with your buddy on the job site, let's say, and he asks you to pass him a wrench, you're not going to invoice him. I think that was David Graeber's famous example. When you're at work, you act, you kind of, there is kind of a to each according to his need and from each according to his ability attitude. People aren't expecting to get paid. You don't expect to get paid for giving someone at work the information they requested of you, or relaying the information, or whatever your function is. You're doing it out of a sense of sort of, community with your coworker, and a sense of united purpose. Or, at home, everyone arrives at the grandparents' house for Thanksgiving dinner. Grandma's not invoicing the grandkids for the turkey, right? There really is a sort of, you kind of make room for the kids to be kids, and you expect more from the adults. There's kind of this shifting scale of social obligation according to your standing or your status. And so it's just interesting to me that what we're talking about is the thing that resonates with our human emotion and who we are as people, the way that things ought to be, in other words. And we should be trying to get the way things are, as close as we can to the way things ought to be, just as a general statement. But there's definitely a danger that has to be acknowledged to going too far and too fast. What is it that JBP says? Don't carelessly denigrate existing social structures or existing traditions. That's definitely the point that has to be made by looking at all the worst parts of communism and socialism, or at least the history thereof.
Well, one thing I would say about communism, or it's just that I think the way that things ought to be, like, we need things to work in such a way where like our human nature works for us rather than against us. And I guess what I mean by that, well, I do think that like the hierarchy, like humans are inherently hierarchical. Our political system should kind of represent that. I think when people say capitalism is more natural or whatever, well, they're trying to get at that there is like a hierarchy. Another thing is that like capitalism and communism, I wouldn't describe either as good or bad. They're just political tools. And so for the in certain situations, you're going to want one or the other. And so, I don't know, I don't exactly know what the political system should be that we have, but I don't know. It's got to do justice to our human nature.
Well, I definitely agree that we can't expect perfect people or perfect citizens. We need to, have a system, like you say, that runs on the basis of the way that people actually are. But I think that a sense of community is a big part of that. And I think democracy is a big part of that too. And I think technology has to be a part of it also, just given how integrated the ongoing advent of both democracy and technology seem to be, how central those two trajectories seem to be to the overall human trajectory. Maybe the internet is like wiring us all together like some kind of massive neural net, so that we make decisions collectively much better than any one individual egoic node of the network can make decisions. And maybe we're emerging as some kind of consciousness that is like a superstructure to our current level of consciousness, and maybe that's what's evolving here. And maybe AI is part of that. But something where we make decisions communally. There's something about the connection between people that is the best part of being alive, right? It really gets to what makes life worth living. And so I think that has to, the future has to be centered around that. That's what makes art so valuable, and what the Italian Renaissance was all about. It creates a connection between people, because you can tell that the person who's creating the art that you are vibing with is seeing or feeling the same things you are. It's like the establishment of a connection. In short, nothing could be more compatible with the vagaries of human nature than a future that is technologically, in which we are linked into a community through technological augmentation, like the internet or the Neuralink or some kind of crazy sci-fi equivalent.
Well, just like self-mastery, though, like, is probably the point of existence, right? Or it would be awesome to, like, merge into one kind of super consciousness and manifest our collective will. But just on the other side of the coin, I don't know, like, self-mastery does seem like the real point of existence.
Self-mastery in the sense of achieving your potential, getting control of yourself over your ego, like not doing the thing, like resisting the stream of what your lower order consciousness wants to do to achieve great heights, something like that. This is what you mean by self-mastery?
I guess, yeah, to successfully, like, realize your will on yourself. I mean, what else is there really to do beyond self-mastery on this earth, right?
Is there a version of self-mastery that is satisfactory in and of itself, or do you have to leverage it on behalf of other people, your family, your community, your friends, your family, like whatever the social relation is that a necessary part of it if you just do self-mastery? So in other words, is there any point to art if art doesn't have an observer, right? Is there any point to self-mastery if you can't, like I say, leverage it on behalf of others? Or is it enough to master yourself and you don't need that added component?
Well, certainly if there weren't other people out there also, well, I think it's inherent to our existence that, like, just all of our social instinct is kind of, well, you gotta keep up with the Joneses, or obviously we're just social beings, and interacting with people, affects how we think about ourselves. And
self-mastery as satisfactory in and of itself for its own sake, or do you need other people to also, do you need other people in the trenches with you to make it meaningful?
Yeah, obviously other people. I mean, if other people weren't attempting to self-mastery, then there'd be no drive. They also set the yardstick and also make it possible, because if no one had any mastery, I don't know what we'd be doing here. So, I mean, obviously, how other people are instrumental in self-mastery.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think that it's just like the Italian Renaissance with its explosion of art as a result of social currents being revived and society becoming less sedentary and more dynamic. And so I think that's really where we're at today. Like we are awash in art that's produced by corporate bodies that are incapable of giving us an authentic view on reality because it runs counter to their self-interest. In short, we need Jimi Hendrix. Where is he? Like, we need our generation of great artists to arise and to reflect this reality back at us, so we can all agree what's happening, so we can grapple with what's happening. That's my contention. What do you think? Is there a dearth of art that like there's no version we have of the great explosion of art and of technological innovation that came about in the 1960s vis-a-vis Silicon Valley and rock and roll? Both of which were LSD fueled, by the way. It's funny to note that the inventor of LSD, Dr. Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist he synthesized LSD from ergot in 1936. He wrote a letter to Steve Jobs in like 2003 or 4 post iPod, about his remarkable achievements, because Steve Jobs had been very vocal about LSD being integral to his invention thereof. And then of course there's like the Beatles' famous trip to the Maharashtra. What's the word for it? I forget the word, but they went to England to study under this guru, and there was a bunch of LSD involved, and then that's when you get like the magical mystery tour, the White Album, Abbey Road, and the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It's impossible to understate the interesting impact of LSD on the 1960s. But we don't seem to have what we need to have is a similar outpouring of art, like the Rolling Stones, Janis Joplin, Bob Dylan. We need our version of these guys. And I don't know, man, there's a lot of mumble rappers, but not a lot of real meat to be found on that bone. So you're much more musically inclined than I am. What do you think? Where is our great artistic explosion? What's happening? Why isn't it arriving?
Yeah, well, we've got Taylor Swift and I like Ed Sheeran. Those are and the Foo Fighters. That's like that's like the best start we've got, which, you know, I guess is okay. Yeah, well, obviously we're thirsty pilgrims wandering a desert when it comes to art. I mean, you get the occasional Quentin Tarantino movie. There's podcasts that are, you know, okay. So it's happening there to some extent.
You think Taylor's capable of becoming the bard of a generation? I mean, we millennials, we need one. You know, the lads from Seattle in the 1990s are not our generation. We need our own great heroes of song.
Maybe Taylor Swift can write a song called "Tax the Rich."
Well, Taylor, if you're out there, help us out. Come on, we need some real art. Possibly some LSD would be a good place to start, I might suggest. If history is any indicator at all, I feel like that's really, to borrow Aldous Huxley's term, the door of perception that you might need, my girl. So get after it, will you? Yeah,
she could make some like wildly psychedelic albums.
Yeah, it'd be nice. We should hope for such a thing. Well, I think that I always like T-Mac's. T-Mac, of course, is Terence McKenna, the famed ethnobiologist who wrote up some truly eyebrow-raising books, but died of cancer, I think, in 2001, 2002. God, when I think of the minds that we need in this moment, Chris Hitchens and Terence McKenna are my number one and number two. You got to be kidding me. I can't believe those guys got taken too early. We could have had their input at this moment. It's too tragic to even contemplate. But this T-Mac would always have this notion that you could turn your living room with the introduction of a psychedelic into the bridge of Magellan's vessel that first circumnavigated the globe. And he had this analogy of sending out explorers to the very fringes, the frontiers of human consciousness, in order to see what of value they can bring back. This aligns with the notion of the quest, the alchemical idea of the journey through the dark forest, this whole notion that if you go out and adventure, you can find something of value and bring it back for your people, and that way become a hero. I mean, that really is the journey that we need basically all young people to be taking. You know, we may have our ideas of the best way to fashion a new society, but let's be real, we just live in this apartment tower. We have no influence. So we are going to need a whole lot of people putting their mind to this problem, a lot smarter minds than mine. And so we should be we need new ideas. We should be sending these voyages, funding these voyages like Ferdinand and Isabella, funding these voyages to the horizons of the human consciousness to bring back something, anything, any novel ideas that we can sift through and determine what's going to be the way that we're going to carry on going forward. Because crazy women screaming in the streets and finally losing their mind is no way to run a society. We could be doing so much better. Better, apparently, to the tune of 28 vacant homes for every unhoused person in the U.S. Yikes. So what do you think? I mean, I think it's like Is conversations like these enough to get the ball rolling? Like, we're going to have to be like the Scarecrow in that movie, The Batman Begins, and introduce LSD to the water supply. That's our friend, the captain's idea. That's always hilarious. Like, what's it like? Would it be like a Salem witch trial kind of accidental ergotism, or the Munster Rebellion kind of ergotism? I'm not sure. I think that at least conversation has to be the beginning.
I think you at least, like, I imagine that Elon Musk owning Twitter going up to the next election here is probably good news. I mean, people don't like Elon Musk, but I mean, there's some things in place anyway.
I don't know what to make of that dude either. He doesn't, I mean, I don't know. At least the world is more interesting with him. It's like the Donald, you know, it's like, at least they're interesting. I don't know what my final analysis would be on Mr. Musk. But I certainly hope that Twitter won't be banning relevant news stories in the run up to next year's election. Hopefully, it'll be a little more sane than that. Yeah, I don't know. It's really going to be a wild year. It does feel like the zit has to burst in 2024. Or what do you think? Is that a mistaken impression you get from a news media that's always ratcheting things up to 11?
I mean, I think if the Donald gets elected, it'll be pretty real. I think if anyone but besides an establishment candidate, most likely Democrat, gets elected, then it's probably going to get pretty real. Like, here's a naughty question. If supposing Hillary Clinton had won instead of, Donald Trump, I mean, would we still have had the COVID?
Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, man. It's really, see, the thing about when you have feckless institutions, and one of those institutions is your apparatus of like figuring out what's going on in society, like the newspapers and the media. Like when you find out they're feckless and will totally lie to you, now you're like, okay, so what of the raft of this whole raft of ideas and concepts and experiences I had that I think is going on, that the mental model of whatever's happening in society in my brain, like how much of it's based on false testimony? Because let's be real, precious little of it is based on firsthand experience. Most of it's something you saw or read or heard or whatever it might be. So I do worry about that, obviously.
Well, just one thing that's certainly, we have to have this conception of everything going on in the world, and thanks to like, high-speed internet, like we just hear about like what's going on like in the Ukraine and in China, and we see everyone's social media, and now we have this huge, like our conception of the world is just so like high resolution at this point compared to where it would have been like, 50 years ago and before cell phones and 5G.
And it's warped, so it's a conception of the world that I think it's high resolution and also more prone to being more admits of being monkeyed with more than the old ways. I think anyway. I don't know. Maybe that means we have a pretty good sightline on reality. Maybe we have a perch, an advantageous perch, unparalleled in history from this electronic vista that we can kind of take in real time.
Well, I mean, we're definitely overclocking our CPUs with TikTok, and we're a little worse for wear. And our model of the world's not that good, but I don't know. We're doing it nonetheless.
You ever heard Dr. Eric Weinstein's response to that? That at the same time as our attention spans being destroyed, we're also consuming long-form podcasts like this very one, and watching the arcs of characters over across 8 seasons on Game of Thrones. So in some ways, we're also paying more attention or longer attention. In some ways, the window of our attention span seems to open. Think there's any credence to that?
Well, we don't have ADD for things that are actually interesting.
Yeah.
But just like the threshold of what's interesting has been raised drastically. To be fair to us, technology should have solved our, dystopian present times long ago, but we're suffering under the cruel whip of our capitalist overlords.
Yeah, well, maybe it's inevitable though that things will get better, right? Maybe we won't be the ones to screw the pooch, despite this slight downturn in the grand trajectory of society. Maybe we're just in a weird little twilight time between the moment when technology improves everyone's lives and makes it much easier to live than it ever has been before, and we're just a little hangover period from a little growing pain getting to that point. That sort of cultural, that sort of anthropological or historical fatalism is something that definitely gets classified as Marxist, or it's definitely part of the ideas that Karl Marx would sometimes write about. So I think that the idea that we are that there is a dam about to burst, of maybe it would take the form of artistic expression. I mean, we would get our generation's Jimi Hendrix, something like that. Someone who isn't going to take instructions from a corporate boardroom. We had to find some way to make that happen. Maybe that's what maybe the revolution could take a form that's like that. We could figure out some way to more equitably create and distribute the things that we all need to live our lives. Maybe as you say, that's inevitable, and that technology is the way we're going to be able to achieve that. That certainly seems like it's been the case over history in the broad sense. So, what do you think, Brian, in terms of a timeline? Like, I mean, it's you don't want to making predictions is a good way to to show that you have no idea what's really going on. But I think we have to measure with the acceleration we're seeing here in Portland. I think it has to be in a less than 10-year time frame before people are going to finally say, we've just had it. We can't. The current management has to go. We can't tolerate it anymore. At what point are we going to stop being at each other's throats in this culture war that you mentioned at the top of the podcast? Do you think it could be as less than 10 years? Do you think that we have to more like 50 years? Or do you think that the assumption, the underlying assumption, is somehow flawed? What kind of timeline do you think going forward? What's your best guess?
I mean, I could see it stretching out, and people just being stretched thinner and thinner over a long period of time. But it's what I was saying before. It could certainly happen as soon as this election. Or if AI just completely jumps out, I mean, I suppose that could happen any day too. But so I'm just open-minded, I suppose. I mean, it does seem like change has to happen one way or another. Yeah, it's not good news when eventually the homeless people are going to start attacking. It's not surprising.
For me, I really realized that the system was due for a failure when I was in student loan debt peonage. I really couldn't afford a salary and to pay my student loans and to do much. I could afford to pay rent and eat, but that was really about it. And I was pinioned in a situation I didn't really know how to escape from for a long time. And that led me to believe, there's something wrong with the system. I assumed that there was guardrails in place to stop financial disasters like this from happening. But there were not at all. And I should have been, much more responsible and looking out for myself. But the fact that this is possible to go to college and then come out with so much debt that you can't, my loan payments were $1,200 every month. It was just being strangled. That's when I realized, there's something fundamentally wrong with the system, and it's going to be something that heaps that kind of debt on its young people who are, who is really not a system that can perpetuate itself into the future for too much longer. I used to say that to people, and they would just be, they had no idea what I was talking about. For them, things seemed like they were fine, and it's been very interesting to see the realization set in for everyone that things are not fine, something is definitely wrong. I think the wake-up call for a lot of folks was maybe 2016 when the Don got elected and our politics became deranged beyond recognition. But if it wasn't 2016, definitely the COVID has brought everyone onto this side of the ledger. That has really been an interesting development to see, but I can't believe that it's lasted this long, that we're still in this weird sort of twilight. So I guess I am interested that you also think it could be in the in the single digits of years before we have to have some real shakeup. And I bet it resonates with a lot of people who might be listening to this podcast. I bet for a lot of folks out there, they really sense that downward trajectory. But I think the positive anecdote, the way to spin that positively is that it's always darkest before the dawn, and so far in history, there's been some during the collapses of these times of collapse of previous civilizations. There's always something always arises to bring us back from the abyss. Maybe it's Christianity during the fall of Rome, or maybe it's the magical tradition in the medieval period, or some kind of recognition that there's more to life than the obvious bubbles up, and so maybe so we should be looking forward maybe to that wave of artistic expression or something like that.
Well, see, I feel like the left side politically is to hope for some kind of change, because I mean our system is terribly broken. The right sort of point of view would be, self-mastery can be achieved at any time. Is important regardless of the state of society. So yeah, I don't know. That's the politically right side.
Yeah,
of the
well, can you
message.
transcend the left-right political divide that to say that self-mastery leveraged on behalf of others is the real closing of the horseshoe on that front, and try to move forward with the unified ideal on that front? I don't know. I mean, I like the idea of comparing it to the artist and the observer of the art.
All right. Well, that seems optimistic enough.
Yes. All right. Well, let's leave it. Yeah, let's leave it there, and we'll look forward to doing episode 4 next week. Always fun, man.